There was once a new war, a new scandal, a new crisis. One week it's this nation or that one. One week it's inflation, the next it's migrants. Then it's a climate catastrophe or this neighboring country. And behind each of one of these storms, there's a chorus of voices, not just reporting what happened, but telling you forcefully what it means and how you should feel about it. Who the villain is, who the hero is, who you should hate, who you must cheer. And if you hesitate, if you pause long enough to try and think for yourself, you're accused of betrayal, a traitor, a dupe, a fool, a spineless apologist, a coward. This is propaganda. It is not new, not even remotely. It is the oldest trade of power, older than currency, older than the written law. If you want to understand how to be immune to it, it'll be useful to go back, not a few years ago, not a few decades, but to the deep sediment of history, where this practice was first taking root. Because propaganda is not just an ugly, modern invention, it is the DNA of empire. The Greek historian Thucydides, in his brutal account of the Peloponnesian War, noted something chilling, that in wartime words changed meaning. Reckless audacity came to be considered courage of a loyal ally. In other words, reckless speculation became refreshing honesty. Prudent hesitation was seen as cowardice. That was 2,500 years ago. Already in Athens, the supposed birthplace of democracy, public speech was warped by conflict. Audacity was renamed loyalty. Doubt was renamed treachery. Language itself bent under the weight of necessity. That is the embryo of propaganda, the manipulation of words until they no longer describe reality, but dictate allegiance. The Romans learned this lesson well. Bread and circuses. Triumphs paraded through the city to remind citizens of victories abroad, whether or not those victories justified the coffins arriving in secret. Emperors carved their image into every coin, every monument, an ancient form of branding. Propaganda is not the invention of television or Twitter. It is the eternal hunger of rulers to possess not only your obedience, but your perception of reality itself. Fast forward to the Catholic Church in 1622, Pope Gregory XV founds the Congregatio de Propaganda Fide, the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. Its mission, to spread Catholic doctrine, combat heresy, and bluntly win the global PR war against Protestantism. That's where the very word comes from, propaganda. Not lies, not manipulation, not fake news, but the propagation of belief. From the very start, propaganda was understood as a legitimate tool of the righteous, necessary for God's plan. This is another constant. It is always the other side. For the Church, it was the Protestants spreading falsehoods. For the Protestants, it was Rome. For the moderns, it's always the other political party, the other nation, the other ideology. Immunity to it begins with recognizing that propaganda is not a partisan tool. It is the language of power itself. Enter Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Bernays published a slim book with the modest title Propaganda. It became the manual for the 20th century persuasion. He wrote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society." There it is. Not manipulation is a danger to democracy. No, manipulation is an important element. For Bernays, propaganda was not just the tool of tyrants, it was the lubricant of modern mass democracy. And he practiced what he preached. Bernays helped women take up smoking by branding cigarettes as torches of freedom. He helped overthrow the Guatemalan government on behalf of United Fruit by flooding the American press with stories of communist infiltration. He turned psychology into a weapon, an invisible government of the mind. Bernays was honest in one sense. He said outright that democracies were run not just by votes, but by engineers of consent. The spin doctors, advertisers, and media barons who tell you what is normal, desirable, patriotic. The visible politicians are only the surface. Beneath them are the manipulators. It's easy to detect the skeleton. Repetition. Say it enough times and it becomes truth. Think of every slogan that's ever said by every politician. These are not mission statements. These phrases are only designed to bypass thought. Emotion over logic. Propaganda never asks for you to reason. It asks for you to feel. Fear, pride, outrage. Reason is too slow. Feelings are what mobilize. Symbols and spectacle, flags, parades, anthems, bread and circuses rebranded. Orwell called it duck speak, speech without thought. Enemy making, the world reduced to us and them, saints and demons, patriots and traitors. The enemy is often vague, shifting, sometimes even invisible, but that makes it easier to apply everywhere. Whether it's the Nazis with Goebbels' ministry, the Soviets with Pravda, or your algorithm today, these four levers are always at work. Propaganda doesn't merely deceive, it exhausts. The everyday person already spends their daylight hours in labor, earning wages, feeding families, dragging themselves through the routine humiliations of survival. And when they finally sit at home, drained, the bottomless void of propaganda awaits them. The nightly news, the endless scroll, the speech blaring from the square. It overwhelms with volume and with the sheer repetition until you lack the strength to object. Hannah Arendt, dissecting totalitarianism, wrote, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer exists." Propaganda is most effective not when it persuades, but when it exhausts you into apathy, when you no longer have the energy or the will to separate fact from fiction. Orwell saw it too. In 1984, he wrote, "A hierarchical society was only possible on a basis of poverty and ignorance. Keep people poor, keep them ignorant, and then saturate their remaining mental energy with slogans." Even the ancients recognized this. The Roman poet Juvenal wrote, "Give them bread and circuses, and they will never revolt." Bread for the body, spectacle for the mind. Labor and propaganda combine to forge an unthinking, compliant creature, an NPC. And isn't that still the case? Work all day, stumble home, and then the screen tells you what to believe, who to hate, and what to fear. And now you don't even need to walk home, it's in your pocket all the time when you're seeking a quick fix, and you're too tired to resist, too heartbroken to object. Meanwhile, those in power seem to forever be there, passing the baton to the next one. And propaganda is not only what it is said, but what is not said too. Its power lies as much in omission as in invention. In Orwell's world, inconvenient truths didn't just vanish by accident. They were hurled down a chute. The Ministry of Truth had what was called the memory hole, an incinerator where documents, photographs, even names were dropped, never to be seen again. Winston Smith, a wary clerk, describes it: when one knew that any document was due for destruction, it was an automatic action to lift the flap to the nearest memory hole and drop it in the current of warm air to the enormous furnaces which were hidden somewhere in the recesses of the building. That was Orwell's invention. But was it really? Stalin's Russia had already perfected it. Men who once stood beside him in official portraits suddenly vanished, airbrushed into nothing, their names stripped from encyclopedias, as though they had never lived. And today our world has its own memory hole, sleeker, subtler, but no less lethal to truth, though some are not even so sleek and they still get away with it. Entire scandals erupt, rage for a week, then disappear into silence. The headlines vanish, the witnesses are silenced, the names are never published. By some invisible hand, the story is smothered until it no longer exists in the public mind. Lists and video files are shoved into Orwell's incinerator with the excuse that it was for the protection of victims. The nerve. This too is propaganda, not the lie shouted from the podium, but the truth quietly incinerated, or the evidence hidden away for your own good. Not just the invention of falsehood, but the disappearance of fact, or of, and here English fails me, the desvirtuar la realidad, meaning remove truth's merit as if it were too much for you plebeian to handle, and thus it's best you look the other way. Propaganda doesn't need to refute the truth most of the time, it only needs to suffocate it. And by the time you look up, weary from labor, numbed by distraction, the whole affair has been dropped down the chute, gone forever, and you are told by omission, by silence, that it never was. And now we live in the most propagandized era in history. Not because leaders are cleverer, but because the machinery is instantaneous. The algorithm is the greatest ministry of propaganda ever devised, tailored, personal, and visible. You don't even know you're being nudged, because you think you chose the video. Why so much war? Why so much inflation? Why these ridiculous leaders? The answers are always complicated, but nevertheless intelligible. But the thing is, propaganda thrives in confusion. You must not wrap your head around things. No time for that. The more disoriented you are, the easier it is to shepherd your outrage into the proper channels. If you're exhausted by headlines, that is not a failure of journalism, it is a success of propaganda. So how to be immune? Not by retreating into cynicism. Everyone lies, nothing matters, that's just another form of surrender. Immunity is harder. It's discipline. Slow down. Propaganda demands speed. It lives on panic, on the instantaneous reaction, the instant retreat. Slowness is resistance. Remember history. Every piece of propaganda tries to convince you that this crisis is unprecedented, this leader is unique, this threat is new. It never is. Memory is immunity. Refuse total certainty. Montaigne, the skeptical Frenchman, made a motto: what do I know? The refusal to be absolutely sure is not weakness, but strength. Examine who benefits. Behind every message is an author. Behind every author, an interest. Who gains power, wealth, obedience from this framing? Follow the beneficiary. And this is where the timeless becomes timely. When you hear politicians say that those who hesitate are traitors, hear Thucydides whispering across 2,500 years. When you see a slogan repeated until it becomes air, hear Bernays telling you that manipulation is a foundation of democracy. When you watch leaders build enemies out of fog, remember the Catholic Church renaming persuasion as holy duty. And when you scroll your feed drowning in noise, remember Rome's bread and circuses. Remember that distraction itself is the oldest trick of rulers. Propaganda is everywhere. It can drown the airwaves, fill the headlines, dominate the hashtags, echo in every conversation, but it cannot reach the one place that resists all empire, the individual conscience. The only true immunity to propaganda is the decision not to outsource your thinking. That decision is rare. It is difficult, it is lonely, but it is also the oldest act of rebellion available to a human being. Montaigne again, the greatest thing in the world is to know how to belong to oneself. That is the cure, to belong to yourself. Propaganda has always seemed impossible to escape, until you do. The rulers of every age have told us that words mean what they say, that enemies are what they declare, that loyalty demands blindness, and yet, through every empire, some people resisted. They refused to give away their minds. You can do the same. So when the next war breaks out, the next scandal erupts, the next slogan screams at you, pause. Remember, this is not new. Remember who benefits, and remember you are not helpless, because in the end, propaganda is not the manipulation of the masses, it is the voluntary surrender of the individual. And the only immunity is to decline, to give yourself away.
You have a right to be what you are and say what you think, because here we have personal freedom, we have liberty. And these are not just fancy words, this is a practical and priceless way of living.